this question that is vulnerability. So in this case, we're looking at narratives and accounts of whatever is happening around the world and how these things thrive in these groups under the framing of a few things, such as fantasy, the inherent twists over how fantasy portrays any given situation or picture, and the wish fulfillment that such fantasy services. The remarks that follow also take off from another presentation that happened exactly here, actually, which was on the exploitation of social antagonists. Ostensibly speaking, we're in a state of crisis. Personally, I would assert that this crisis is the double-edged crisis of capitalism and modernity, that are having both material and cultural manifestations of an ongoing restlessness. However, the problem remains how one goes about identifying the current crisis. As quite concretely speaking, people are generally confused about what's going on. And part of the issue here amounts to the proliferation of misdiagnosis over what's wrong. To give an example, in far-right groups, the logic of the paranoid misdiagnosis of the current crisis is being sourced in globalist, unrestricted internationalism, as opposed to global capitalism. And it is here we have to start paying attention closely, because we find that people's material grievances under capitalist conditions get redirected. We can simply ask the question, how do we end up with workers that will defend their state of exploitation? How do we find people that are fighting against their own interests? Quite simply, and I'm going to be working through this text myself, it's going to be Umberto Eco's Or Fascism, which is quite a staple work for understanding how polymorphous fascism is. That in each instance we find fascism, it will show different aspects of itself. And I'm going to be talking about some of the aspects that are in Umberto Eco's essay that manifests itself in some of the local papers that we're talking about, also understanding how fantasy plays a role in this understanding of fascism. So, quite simply put, in Umberto Eco's essay, we answer this question of how do we end up with people that work against their own interests. And for this notion of or fascism, almost like a transcendental sense of fascism, there's no struggle for life, but rather life is lived for struggle. When a struggle is turned meaningful, we begin to see how fantasy cracks and distorts the images of how a given social, political, and economic situation looks. This is the problem that we have in the left, that we have miserably failed to speaking to these subjective needs of fantasy. And in turn, we have surrendered this territory to the right wing. By conceding the territory of subjective needs and fully focusing on material ones, we have left the gates wide open for an overwhelming current of reactionary positions to muscle their way into important areas of the human experience. And these include aesthetics, spirituality, myth building, and myth narratives. When we look at a claim like globalism, when we treat globalism as if it were the real contemporary threat, we highlight that the globalist claim is only sustained by conspiracies and contrivances that exploit racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, that nevertheless reinstate and perpetuate the current state of crisis as if it were meaningful, as if the struggle itself were corresponding to a higher purpose, to some form of elusive puppet master. Yet these conspiracies and contrivances remain but discursive symptoms, not seeing people's thinking whereby a hatred can claim by a continuous shifting of rhetorical focus, and here I'm quoting Eco, that enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. Now, this particular example, this claim that our enemies are both strong and weak, we can find in some of the groups in Edmonton, and here I'll name a few. The Canadian Combat Coalition, Wolves Soldiers, Nouns of Odin, the Northern Guard, and so on. The fantasy they set up in luring people into recruitment plays on these idiosyncratic narratives to redirect the critical anxieties of this crisis, whereby both Antifa need to get jobs, and Antifa are paid protesters by George Soros. Thank you for that. It's here is where there's some fantastical conspirative concept of the black, the Jew, the woman, and in more current terms, the Norman, the non-playable character, Antifa super soldiers. Shut up. In absence of any of these, though, because there's nowhere really, you will never find the ideal black, you will never find the ideal woman. These are both ideals that serve as fantasy for its devices. But in absence of all of these, they are everywhere, patching inconsistencies into conspiracies and contrivances that never quite detect the real antagonism. Conspiracies and contrivances amount to a symbolic fiction that grants the mere semblance of something meaningful, a significant order. Others are but the phantasmic specter of what fantasy tries to patch over and bring into a semblance of consistency. We are covered up. That's a fun because conspiracy theories and being covered up. Thank you. I'm here all night. Now, the fantasy aggrandizes itself, or it renders a struggle completed as life as meaningful. The struggle is life is meaningful, struggle is meaningful. We will be quick to note, at the core of these concerns, we find that these groups, I kind of stop here. We will be quick to note, at the core, these concerns of these groups do tie into other crises I talked about, particularly the crisis of modernity, that has come about into a lot of discourses of what people call cultural decadence. You probably heard some form of talk of this or another at some point or another. So in modernity, we see that a lot of beliefs that we held intimately close to us, that even constituted a sense of who we are and how we get ourselves around the world, these things have fallen into question constantly. And yet we have been left with a restlessness and discontent over what comes next in both the individual and the social to fill this gap, this void in ourselves. Ego notes, for example, how the fashion reactionary traditionalism implies a rejection of modernity. This rejection turns to an irrational call to action for its own sake. What we're finding here is this appeal to tradition, this appeal to tradition as if it were meaningful and sustainable. And here we find this in platitudes such as cutting the bullshit. They don't want to think about what they're doing. In fact, we find that in a lot of these groups, thinking is thought as a form of emasculation. There's a reason why they call everyone cuts. That's because that's exactly what they're worried about, a form of emasculation. And we have to know that for all this fragility that's coming up, these fantasies are aggrandizing themselves to the point that they form forms of occult and obscure fascist mysticism. I'll talk about a contemporary example here in Edmonton. And an example of this would be the YouTuber, the Ellen Contactee, otherwise known as Hail to the King. Sorry, there's a few people that have been watching this news bullshit for some time. So, the Ellen Contactee, otherwise known as Lionel Law, and this is my personal nickname for him, Linoleum Anderson, sitting at 19K subscribers with an active stream of content manifesting such a leaning towards the occult tradition. He's also recurring as Vernon Yellowvester, so we've seen him around a few times here and there. He's consistently invested on a delusion that continues to chase after this long-lost sense of origin that one is alienated from. But in reconstructing such an origin, it was incorporated as part of a delusion of a cosmic connection of Lionel to a There's this constant pursuit of a sense of gravity tradition. What we find here is a curious or simple tension, also what we were talking about earlier, between calling your enemy both strong and weak. There's, in this case, a recognition of a fundamental sense of vulnerability, the one we were talking about earlier, which is at the same time obscured by the other side of fantasy. We can think about this as the live-action role-playing, LARPing, that hate groups perform in their vigilante stunts with heroic fantasy. And this comes with the repression of a fundamental problem that is sought to be overcome, as is one where we touch it. Vulnerability continues to be a core issue, but the way in which it has been integrated into these group fantasies reflects a certain reframing of how vulnerability counts. A hate group will be more ready to count symbolic fictions such as the Great Replacement, the Decline of the West, and the death of culture due to cultural Marxism as expressions of their vulnerability over irreducibly real conflicts in precarious distresses of other people. Even Lionel Linoleum Anderson's obscure cosmic origin is given precedence over actual precarity. However, and I'm starting to wrap up right here, we need to know that though such restlessness and sense of vulnerability in hate groups may actually think of as an actual crisis that's going on, when we encounter these symbolic fictions, we have already redirected the concern sustaining the state of crisis as if it were meaningful and a significant affair. In this respect, fascist mysticism is exemplar in transcendentalizing such a struggle as if it were the national or even a cosmic spirit possessing the people to work its will through them. And to start wrapping up, here I'm going to describe the core thought that protests thought about, the colonization of vulnerability, where not only are some forms of insecurity exploited to perpetuate their insecure state, but also dismissing the vulnerability of others as a way of regulating any legitimacy to the claim of vulnerability. In short, one is trying to put in a situation where one has to justify the vulnerability of solely being to even make it worthwhile being vulnerable and existing. But even more insidiously, these groups frame the very form of justification in accordance to an idiosyncratic sense of consistency in the contrivances and conspiracies that they offer as to de facto discard vulnerability of others. The work at hand is to a segregation to the claim of vulnerability in a very fundamental sense, and thus a segregation from the claim to solely being general. So moving forward, quite simply, instead of relying on the misdiagnosis and sustaining the restlessness over the crisis, we may know that global capitalism is not meaningful. Meaning only comes across as such in the form of a higher relation or a purpose that seeks to justify and exploit the irrational state of disenfranchisement at hand. In the depth of fantasy, one can and will defend it from anything otherwise, as a way to preserve one's identitarian symptoms from the emancipatory process that we're calling for. It is in an eventual break, like an economic crisis, where capitalist realism cannot be contained from collapse. That becomes apparent at this point that the real contemporary threat is in fact global capitalism prolonging its state and the hoarding of enjoyment. This is exactly the kind of wish fulfillment that the framing of fantasy for hate groups and xenophobic organizations serves.